So round of applause for David.
Thank you. I'll just give you a brief history. I started out as a photographer. I started photography when I was like 15. My whole education was in photography. And starting in 1990, I decided to stop using a camera and use the scanner as my camera. And from then on, I've been only working with computers. I've done a little bit of digital photography, but basically my practice now especially is, and I'll end with a video of a piece I'm working on. And I'm all self-taught. Of everything I've done up to this point has been self-taught, so which is an important part of the medium that digital media from my generation, because there were nowhere to go to really learn this stuff. So this lecture is going to sort of be the start in sort of conceptually in the mid 19th century and go all the way to the like 1970, and then I'm going to make a huge leap, and then show what we do at the Beall, and then show one of my pieces. And the idea is to show where the idea of movement in art led to participation in art. And that then, by the 80s and 90s, digital media took up that mantle of doing work that was interactive. And I would imagine you're going to get that in other points in this class. Where I'm going to start, let's see if this works. Okay. So from the mid-19th century toward the late 19th century, it was believed that science would be able to prove everything, that the world would become a clock. The whole metaphor of the clock as the way the universe works was embraced by Newton, started with Newton and went up to the 19th century, mid to late 19th century. And this began to fall apart towards the end of the 19th century through a number of observations, both in philosophy, Bergson, and science, Einstein, and then finally with mathematician Gödel, who ultimately said, and quantum dynamics. And then Gödel ultimately said that there could be no system actually created that doesn't have a paradox. So this is a movie by Bertov called Man with the Camera. And what this also started in the late 19th century in the introduction of the trolley car into the city. And at this point, the acceleration of life made exponential leap, not unlike what you guys are going through now. People were getting run over by these trolley cars because they didn't know how to cross the street. There were cartoons made about it. And this film, done in the 1920s, was to sort of show you how that acceleration felt, and did it through the technique of montage, of cutting. So by this point, people had gotten used to this acceleration of time, which then led in cinema to this idea of cutting, of putting disparate images together in different arrangements. So this movie is a lot about speed, acceleration, time, and just a lot of interesting techniques that had never been done before. So this is more about how people began to feel. This became a sort of a metaphor, an analogy of what people were already feeling, and had the capacity to absorb this kind of speed. But the first artist to really involve the audience in a new way, let's see, is it working? Was Wagner. He actually designed a theater specifically to present his works. And those works were the first piece to be played at this was The Ring. And the very first of those was actually written last. And the music you're hearing now is the first, what's called drone music or minimalist music, that later in the 70s would take on a new life. So this is the theater he actually designed. So he believed in what was called the Kunstwerk, the complete work, that the artist being him, collaborated with set designers, libretto, all the different set design, everything to create the whole work. And then it sort of works within the idea of multimedia. And I'm going to make a distinction between multimedia as the lecture goes on, and it's a different kind called intermedia. So, which is more, it comes out in the 60s. So you can see it was a very elaborate theater he built, just to show his work. And so it also, the sound was meant to work within that sonic environment. He'd write the music for that space. So then we come to actually capturing time. So we have, this is before cinema really embraced this sort of idea of montage. And what E.J. Murray and Muybridge, who I think you may have already seen or you will be seeing again, were able to capture was movement for the first time. No one had seen in very discrete, infinitesimal movements how we actually move through space. Mathematics had described it through calculus, but no one had actually seen it. And also, calculus was not even proven as until the mid 19th century. So you sort of have this as the first data visualization of a scientific concept. So in E.J. Murray's practice, he would have a dark room and he'd flash a light a bunch of times to get these multiple images. Muybridge did a different technique. He set up a bunch of cameras and then photographed people moving around. The top piece was based on a bet between him and the governor of California, of whether a horse at full gallop, all legs are off the ground at the same time, and he proved it. So Muybridge won the bet. You can see right there, they're all off the ground. So these are things, again, that no one had ever seen before. The other thing that this brought up is the idea that cinema would eventually really exploit is art before this was about the pose. So you have this image by David of Napoleon, and this actually probably never happened. He constructed a composition and a dramatic moment in order to exemplify Napoleon's heroics. And you can see that the composition is all well worked out. The tail moves this way, the finger goes that way, and the hair, the mane here is going that way. So everything is really planned. But once you have this, suddenly the ideal pose loses its power. And any pose, an idea that was later named by Deleuze, was any pose whatever, that any pose is as valid as any other pose. And that this is a series of images by E.J. Murray breaking the body down into stick figures. And then those photographs had a huge impact on painting. This is futurist painting. You can see there's a horse. It's like all that movement and activity was really beginning to explore the effect of even more. Some people say that painting went to abstraction because of photography, but also movement became part of painting that had never been before in this way. This one looks just like a Moray. You know, the moving legs, the leash going back and forth. And then in 1905, Charles Ives wrote this amazing piece of music that's somewhat similar to Wagner, except the idea is it's in no key. So it's the first piece of music, one of the first pieces of music that has no key. And the instruments are in different parts of the audience. They're not all in the front. One's in the back, one's in the front, and one's on the side. So the audience is placed in the middle of the work. They're surrounded by the sound. So this is also one of the first times that someone thought about the idea of, as far as I know, of the audience being central to the work and not just it being presented to them out. And this begins to approach more what I would call intermedial practice as opposed to multimedia, where multimedia, again, is everything that's orchestrated into one thing, like in most movies are multimedia. And then we come to Cubism. A lot of people will say that Cubism was influenced by cinema. And I think in some ways there's actually a movie that makes that thesis. I actually think this work is more about before our brain organizes reality, this is how the world looks. And we have to our brain deciphers the world and reconstructs it into something we can recognize. And to me, this is sort of the feeling of the process of your brain, of actually the way, in some ways, how, sort of in a poetic way, how we actually decipher the world and have to sort of look for things and discover things in a sort of chaotic environment. And if you look at the way people's eyes move in in a lot of ways, eyes move just like this. There's always scanning and moving around. So to me, this is less about movement and more about perception. Because when you see this next to Duchamp's Nude Descending the Staircase, you really see movement. It's undoubted. It's a body moving down a stairway and still using the Cubist technique of this sort of crystalline image, but it's actually a repeating image. So it creates a different effect. And keep an eye on those little dots. It's hard to see right there. Those little dots on the torso in the middle, you'll see in a minute. So if you look at these, so those blades away.
I think so.
Oops, what did I just do? If you look right there, these little dots, and you see those little dots here. And E.J. Murray was French, so it's more than likely that Duchamp saw his works. And actually, that looks like motion capture that we do today. So the other thing that Duchamp did that was very important is he redefined what sculpture was. Up to this point, sculpture was stone, marble, metal, all kinds of different materials that people used to sculpt with. He used found objects. The other thing about this piece, it's the first interactive work of art. And I'll show you a video in a bit about playing with that idea by an artist. So this, you can actually spin the wheel. Now, I don't know when the last time in a gallery you could actually spin the wheel, but the other thing that I discovered in my research over the years on this piece, because I've been showing it for years and talking about it purely as interactive work, I found out actually this is an example of new technology. This wheel, this type of ball-bearing wheel was invented in 1913 when this piece was made. So this piece would not have been possible technologically for its effect of spinning the wheel and watching it move freely and the effect of the spokes going by before that. Because before that, bicycles were not ball-bearing wheels. So this innocent work is actually new technology. And then Picabia, one of Duchamp's friends, actually was also influenced this idea of the machine, and his works were like gears, and they were both worked in sort of mode of architectural drawings or industrial sort of drawing. And the reason why it was important, why that became especially Duchamp and his aesthetic, at least Picabia's early work, later on he abandoned this technique, is they were in school, they added this to the curriculum. So they were all in middle school and high school being taught this kind of drawing. And then it became part of their art. So this idea of the effect of the machine, it also comes from futurism. And all this, all sort of, one of the ways this culminates in popular culture is with Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. What's kind of funny about this is, yes, it's supposed to be assembly line, but in a way, Chaplin's being turned into a piece of film because he's being drawn through that just like film was. So it's sort of this meta relationship between industrialization of the workplace to the industrialization of the medium that he actually worked in, which was cinema. Oops. So back to Duchamp. So another aspect of Duchamp that actually comes also from the bicycle wheel is this idea of the optics of a work of art. So when he spun that wheel, he talks about the spokes going by, and it's like watching a fire, and how beautiful it is to watch the spokes. Well, he pushed that even further into these optical works that that were not quite optical illusions, and actually the effect that got named later on, because this works on your eye differently than a spiral, and he actually made a film, a film using the rotoscopes, and he actually tried to market these. He actually go to conferences and try to sell them as a new kind of industrial. And they could be played on a record player. He had all different modes of the way to do these. And so from the time that Duchamp did the bicycle wheel, he stopped painting. He didn't do any more paintings. So that New Descending the Staircase was actually his last painting. So after Duchamp, then there was just this onslaught of artists that worked in what has now become to be called kinetic art. So this is Nabo. This is a metal rod that's being moved by a motor that was probably really, really noisy. And then when you photograph it, I don't know how fast it actually, I've never seen a video of it, so I don't know to what degree it looked like a standing wave or like a wave, because in a photograph, of course, it looks like that. But it probably made a lot of noise. So you just have to sort of imagine what that felt like to encounter this work, because people just weren't doing this kind of work. Mahalanaj light space modulator is Mahalanaj was taught at the Bauhaus. He was a very most of his work was actually in photography, and this is a film he did of the light space modulator. So this idea of the kinetic, to me, brings in two things. The one of time, in a different way than cinema does, and then also this idea of the body. The minute you see something moving through time and you're standing and looking at it, your body becomes engaged with it differently. To me, with cinema, you're sitting there and engaged with it, and it's more happening in your imagination, and your body is affected through what's going on through you. But it's not as embodied. And this is, as you'll see, has influenced both my curatorial practice and my own work. Calder, whose work would move just through by the air moving. So this was totally non-mechanical kinetic work. So when either the air conditioning system in the museum would make it move, or if this was outside, it would just move by itself. And you've all seen mobiles, I'm sure, or played with them yourself. So now I'm going to shift to cinema to sort of talk a little bit more about this idea of montage and as a poetic method. So in around 1910, Kusaklov, a professor at the film school, did an experiment. And his students were going to become some of the most famous Russian directors, including Eisenstein. So the experiment, and this is the first psychological experiment that I know of for a work of art. So what he did is he took this matinee idol and had him have a neutral face, an intercut, a bowl of soup, a beautiful woman, a dead child, and asked the audience if that person's expression changed. Now to us, we know it's not changing, but to that audience, and they would ask questions and investigate it, and they found out they thought his expression changed. So they understood the power of intercutting and montage. And so if you're interested more in that, I would encourage you to read Eisenstein's writing on montage. And there's all these techniques that you see today that Eisenstein had mentioned. I'm going to give you a more up-to-date example of this that will be more obvious, but is basically the same concept. And this is the director, Alfred Hitchcock.
For pure cinema, the assembly of film, and how it can be changed to create a different idea. Now, we have a close-up. Let me show you what he sees. Let's assume he saw a woman holding a baby in her arms. Now we cut back to his reaction to what he sees. And he smiles. Now what is he as a character? He's a kindly man. He's sympathetic. Now, let's take the middle piece of film away, the woman and the child, but leave his two pieces of film as they were. Now we'll put in a piece of film of a girl in a bikini. He looks, girl in a bikini, he smiles. The dirty old man is no longer the benign gentleman who loves babies. That's what film can do for you.
And that's what you see, everyone does that in cinema. That's just standard practice. And then here is him describing the sophistication of multiple cuts.
We call it cutting. It isn't exactly that. Cutting implies severing something.
You know Hitchcock, that's very funny.
It really should be called assembly. Mosaic is assembling something to create a whole. Montage means the assembly of pieces of film, which, moved in rapid succession before the eye, create an idea. Of course, the most elementary form is the juxtaposition of imagery in various sizes. You know, a lot of people think that color is, or we'll say montage or assembly, is taking a man from one place to another and jumping into a close-up of him, which Griffith invented is true. But to me, it goes much deeper. And as I say, the picture cycle contained quite an amount of cinematic approach to its basic content. In the first place, we had in it the murder of a woman in a shower, of a new woman. Now, as you know, you could not take the camera and just show a new woman being stabbed to death. It had to be done impressionistically. So it was done with little pieces of film. The head, the feet, the hand, parts of the torso, shadow, everything, you see, was the shower itself. I think in that scene there were 78 pieces of film in about 45 seconds.
And Hitchcock was very influenced by Dolly, and this is kind of a very Dolly-esque image to end with. So that's sort of just the idea of how cinema approached time and movement in its own specific way. But like I said before, to me, to get your body out of the chair into a space with a work that's moving or you interact with changes the whole engagement with the work that I think is still underappreciated at this point. This is the first known kinetic exhibition. So here you have a Duchamp work right here, which is a spiral object that moves around by a motor. This is Jean Tinguely. There's a Calder. There's an agam. So, you know, the agams don't move. With the agams, they're more static, but then as you move around the drawing or painting, it moves. It moves and it has a kinetic kind of quality to it. So that's sort of the first sort of block of work that for art that moves in kinetic-based work. And then Jean Tinguely, who's the artist in the middle, sort of ups the ante a lot, and really embraces the idea of the kinetic work as a piece of sculpture, even in a more ambitious way. So he made these huge machines, found, just like Duchamp, they were all used gears and pulleys and all kinds of things. And here, I'm sorry, but I forget the artist's name. I forgot to look it up because I just have this video. So this is an artist that has his kids go into the museum, and I don't know how he got permission to actually interact with the works of art. So this is a drawing machine. So like being on the bicycle wheel, that's drawing. The father saying, "Shh, don't get caught." But he did whole installations of rooms with machines that had motors and were moved on their own. But he did a lot in this sort of series we'll get to that in a second. Then he did this big, ambitious work in 1960 in the Museum of Modern Art Sculpture Garden called The Machine That Destroyed Itself. And it was this huge machine that had a piano, had gears, made noise. It was just this huge thing, and eventually at the end it just falls apart. So it's kinetic, it has sound. And he actually worked with an engineer on constructing this, and they didn't get along at all. And then we come to sort of the next break. So you have Tinguely sort of ending this kinetic, huge sculpture work and really engaging sculpture and being both stand on its own as sculpture, but also it could move. John Cage, who was trained as a musician, was very influenced by Marcel Duchamp, and there's Marcel Duchamp, and they're playing chess. Marcel Duchamp was actually so obsessed with chess that he stopped making art for a while to write a chess book and just to play chess. And so John Cage is the first person not to use the term intermedia, but began to explore this idea of intermedia. So to contrast that, just to remind you a little bit, Wagner's idea of what I call multimedia, or the Kunstgalt work, was to include all phases of art, and in doing so, consume, destroy each one, so to speak, in favor of a total purpose of all. So that was the sort of idea of Wagner in his art making. In Intermedia, the different mediums are all there, but they're not meant to destroy each other. They're supposed to be all acting together. So this piece is them playing chess, and hooked to the chessboard is this set of wires that's controlling some sort of sound device, and depending on what moves they made, controlled the musical piece. So it was always indeterminate what the music piece would be, because it would be different every time they played a game of chess. That's another part of Cage's idea. that, that there's always chance in his work. It's never repeatable. Also, John Cage conceived this idea that all sound was music, and all music is sound. So cars making noise in honking in the street is music. It's whether you call it sound music, it's all the same. There's no hierarchy between Beethoven and sounds on the street. So one of Cage's most interesting pieces were these pieces called prepared piano. So something I discovered recently in doing research for the show the sound show I did, is I thought, so what he would do is he put little objects in the piano and affect the piano strings and then play a piano piece. So I thought he just randomly put them in. He actually, if you look at the score, he actually tells the person going to be playing it exactly what kind of screw or object goes in the strings, where it exactly has to go. And so it's very precise, even though the effect's going to be a little different each time. And this is what it sounds like. It almost sounds like electronic music. So the next artist, who's another kind of break, is Duchamp, who was influenced by John Cage and Duchamp, made his own prepared piano. So Duchamp was also part of a group called Fluxus that I'll talk about in a minute. So this piano, depending on what key you would play, some of the objects would animate. So it was this cacophony of different objects and sounds that he would create. And then here's a detail. And then later on, he would turn to video. And here is what you could call as a prepared piano with video. And along with a couple other artists, Duchamp is one of the first electronic artists and the first one of the early experimenters in video. But to go back to Cage for a second, in the late 50s, John Cage taught a class at the New School for Social Research for a couple of years, and a lot of artists that eventually became Fluxus, among others, took this class, and one of the basic concepts of the class was this idea of a score. Artists traditionally didn't do scores. They may have done a sketch or some way they would do the idea, but they wouldn't actually do a score like the way a composer would do a score. So what Cage gave as an assignment to his students was whatever artwork they were working in, whether they were working in performance, music, electronics, that they would have to draw a score of their work. And then this became a book called Notations. He did a number of books revealing these scores that artists he worked with or collaborated with or taught had made. So this is a score by John Cage, which is more a traditional music score. Here's one by Dick Higgins, who actually conceived of the term intermedia. And if you're interested, it's an interesting book called Intermedia that describes his conception of that term and how it works. This is an electronic artist, and the score becomes the schematic of an electronic piece that he made. Carolee Schneemann, who is a performance artist, also Fluxus, and here's a score of the sequence of events in a performance that she did. So they could be very visual, they could have their own aesthetics, but they're not quite like a sketch. They could be temporal, like this. Like a music score has time in it. So this is a sequence of events that happen over a period of time, instead of separate little images, which he also did. Carolee also did a lot of little sketches, too, besides this kind of score. This is James Tenney, who was an electronic musician who actually was also working at Bell Labs, which was a research space, sort of like what you'd see today at Google or whatever, but it was run by then AT&T, and he was the first one to do computer electronic sound. He was working with the most sophisticated computers at the time. Emmett Williams was a poet. And this is a score that's more of instructions, and I'll show you an example of how a score like this then gets performed in a second. I don't know who this is. Maybe someone. Another sort of word and text. Here's a quote from the engine. Robert Filio, who is a poet and artist, part of Fluxus. So Fluxus had these events mainly. They also made objects. They did all kinds of different types of things. And they usually had these festivals. And this was a score written by Lamont Young, who's actually a musician. And the simple score was draw a straight line and follow it. That's all it said. So what Namjoon did is he dipped his head in ink and then used his body as a paintbrush and painted a straight line with his body. And there's been various variations on this over the years of different artists doing this. So is this performance? Is it a painting? What is it exactly? And it all is sort of happening at the same time. So to me, this is one of the perfect examples of intermedia. It sort of works on you at various different levels, and it's also a live event. And the idea of the score is the person who writes the score doesn't tell the artist what to do at all. They interpret it any way they want. That's sort of the rule, the way it works. And then another artist that's not associated with the Fluxus artists, Alan Capro, did things called happenings. So this is one of his first exhibitions. So all he did was put a bunch of tires into a gallery space. And so in order to look at the work, you had to navigate the tires and sit there. So his idea was to shift the audience from being the viewer of the piece to actually participating in the piece. So this becomes this sort of idea of the audience, the separation between the artwork and the audience sort of disappearing. And so this piece on top is 7 or 8 people licking strawberry off a Volkswagen or a Citroen. I'm not sure what car it is. So that you actually become the art. The audience becomes the artwork. This is gas. That's Alan there. And he created this gas, and you just are in the piece. So the only people that are really outside the work are the people documenting it, really. And if you look it up, he had these rules for his happenings, and he specifically said he was not part of Fluxus, but they were clearly related. So this is In C by Terry Riley, and let me just get exact instructions. So this is also sort of a score-driven piece of music, in that the different participants are told to, In C consists of 53 short numbered musical phrases lasting from half a beat to 32 beats. Each phrase must be repeated an arbitrary number of times. Each musician has control over which phrase he or she plays. Players are encouraged to play the phrases starting at different times, even if they're playing the same phrase. So actually this was recreated here in the music department. They actually used iPhones to recreate this piece following these rules. So again, you have this idea of participation, where the audience becomes the musicians, and you don't really need a lot of musical ability in order to get this to work, and they become the audience. I mean, the audience becomes the performer. And then there's this whole group of conceptual artists who began in sculptural works to explore sort of new ways of talking about things. So this is Hans Hacke's condensation cube. So here you have a work of art where there's obviously a temperature difference between the outside and the inside, so you get condensation. So he's talking about sort of an invisible science. It's sort of got the science aspect, but he's creating an environment where you know that something's happening, but it's not. It's a visual manifestation of something in nature. And this is one of my favorite ones when you think of pre-digital electronic art. This is Elijah Parks, and these were just simple goggles that had kind of a psychedelic effect on the lenses, but you were forced to physically get really close to the person. So you literally had to engage the person in some embodied way. And the most uncomfortable version of this is Ulay and Abramovich's piece, where in order to go into the room to look at work, you had to do this. And when this was redone in New York a couple years ago, they sort of copped out and they had another entrance into the gallery. So you didn't have to walk through them. And it wasn't her performing it. I think it was someone else. She had students that she trained to perform the pieces. But the idea, in a lot of the Fluxus pieces, the idea is no emotion. So they are the ability of Marina Abramovich and her, at this point, her partner, Ulay, you had no expressions. You had to sit there, not move, no expression, as people walk across your nude body. And you think about what it felt like for that person that they had to navigate this space. And clearly they wanted to really exaggerate it by having a person in a suit doing it. So now we're back to Nam June Paik's electronic work. So this becomes the first interactive electronic work of art. So basically what this is a magnet that's above an old style CRT TV. You move the magnet around and the image changes. Now, of course, again, if you were to see this in a museum today, they wouldn't let you do it. And again, this harkens back to this. Both of them have sort of the same thing where you look at them today and you know how they work and what the potential is, but you never can actually experience them. And then here's another image by that video artist. And then here, I recently found, here's Nam June Paik actually moving the magnet around in an exhibition called Cybernetic Serendipity. So you could change abstract shapes, or you could have a video signal coming in and then manipulating that. And then he had a round magnet that he put in front of the screen that did something else. So I recently discovered that I never knew. So here's one of the best examples of the interaction of art and science or technology. So everyone knew about this effect. That Nam June didn't discover that if you put a big magnet on TV, it's going to do this. But he's the first one to make it into a work of art. But then he collaborated with an engineer named Abe. Oh, no, I'll get to that in a second. Oh, no, this is it. So, and what he did was created this thing called the wobulator. And what he did is he put magnets in different parts of the video cathode ray tube and then control the amount of magnetism. I think this is my theory about how it worked. I mean, some of it says by stirring the yolks. And he could then control more accurately what he was doing just with that big magnet. So it looks very similar, but this became the beginnings of video synthesizer that him and Abe created. And then this is the first electronic interactive work of art.
Patient TV.
And if you ever want to look at this, there's a collection up in Santa Barbara called the David Burnett collection that actually has this piece. Another one I'm going to show you. And then this is other works by Namjoon. This is Zen for TV. So Buddha gets to contemplate itself on TV. This is Charlotte Norman playing video cello. And what's interesting about this is in one of the performances there is actually a real cellist playing cello, and then his image is on the TV. And Charlotte Norman was actually a Juilliard trained musician, but her and Namjoon had this, they're very funny videos. If you go online, there's just an amazing group of these funny videos that they did together. And you can see, if you look at the video, the expression on the traditional cellist face is priceless. He's so disgusted with what's going on. This is another piece from the David Burnett collection. And this is basically being controlled by magnets. So there's a big magnet, and it's switching polarity, and so it forces these needles to hit the piano or guitar string a different way. So just like Cage's music, it's kind of random, but it's kind of beautiful and has a nice sound, and the force is invisible. Sort of like Condensation Cube and some others. This is all done around the same time. And this is a new artist that I just discovered, Aldo Teppolini, who was also doing this at the same time.
He started as a painter and a sculptor. And he started taking slides of those paintings and burning them, scratching them, painting on the glass slide cases, and then projecting these incredible shapes. Notably, he was also one of the very first artists to experiment with video and with television.
He said he was 15 years old and he walked beside us there in the littered fields of the ghetto.
When I look at these, they really feel to me like VJ kind of aesthetic, and they're kind of really compelling. And you, again, online, they have. It's all online, all his work. I can get Jesse the URLs. So to sort of to close this part of it, this is Myron Kruger, who did the first interactive work of art. And to me, pretty much most interactive art from this point to now basically worked under the same idea. I do something, it does something. I know that when I do this, it's doing what I want it to do. And it's very direct. And except for a few exceptions, that's basically the definition of interactive art. And as the technology that you all use in your computers with your mouse, and where you really expect that whatever you do with your computer does what you want it to do, that it became harder and harder for artists to break that, because the minute you break it, you think as a viewer that the piece is broken. It doesn't do what you want it to do. So to me, a lot of artists became prisoners of of the interface that was invented by Engelbart, and he invented the mouse and the idea of a keyboard with a visual interface. And this is from a demonstration he did in 1969, that the people were there. It was like nothing that any of them ever experienced. There's been nothing like this really since. Even the iPhone doesn't even come close, or anything that Apple did, come close to what this meant to a whole generation of technology people. Because is the beginnings of the graphical user interface and the mouse and the keyboard that in the way you use them today. Let's make sure I have this quote. So, okay, well, I'll just, this is Chuck Close and Philip Glass. This is this is Chuck Close's paintings. That's of Philip Glass, and they were very good friends. And Chuck Close makes his paintings by doing little dots based on the photograph. And in a documentary that Philip Glass did that was about him, he said that you need, if you want to do something new, you need a new technique. I think you sometimes need a new technology. And to me, that's what's important about a lot of the work I have shown is how it used a new technology, not as to be technological, but in service of the art. From the bicycle wheel to the TV set, whatever the technology, it was always in service to the work of art. And what's interesting about what Paik said at one point, I envision the day when the collaborations of artist and engineer will progress into the unification of the artist and engineer into one person. Therefore, if I give an order to an engineer, and if I don't go through all the experience myself, that is the complicated process of trial and error, I will lose all these previous precious errors I will only get, and I want and miss all the disappointment and surprises. This is the huge problem of the work we show at the Beall, and this idea of the way that the artist either collaborates with technologists or tries to do it on their own. The biggest problem is the way artists make work is by their mistakes. And seeing the mistakes lead them to something else. And to me, if you're going to collaborate with other researchers in your work, which I think you do to get to a more advanced level, because I think the technology is getting so sophisticated that I'm not sure if an artist can capture all that, then these collaborations have to be set up so that allows those mistakes get viewed and don't get edited out of the process. And then this is Namjoon's manifesto on cybernetic art that I encourage you to look at. And then here is just a little videotape on the Beall. The Beall Center for Art and Technology was started in 2000 with original funding by Rockwell International in honor of Don and Joan Beall. The Beall Family Foundation has continually supported the mission of the Beall in all its various forms, from exhibitions, public programs, and education programs. The Beall Center is especially focused on art that uses different forms of science and technology to engage all the senses, not just our eyes. We encourage research and development of artworks that can affect the future. For artists, the Beall Center serves as a proving ground, a place between the artist and studio and the art museum, and allows them to work with new technologies in the early stages of development. We encourage artists that exhibit here to take risks, and we have the unique ability to support them in various ways through research and our expertise. So now I'm out of time, right? It's like 10:30? So for a whole year we have certain themes, such as games, sound, and interactivity. The public programs at the Beall include Family Day, robotics camps, mathbotics, and our new high school program, Expressive Robotics, and hosting the OC Mini Maker Fair. We would like to thank the Beall Family Foundation for their continued support in our exhibitions, public programs, and research. So what I'm going to close with is a piece I'm working on now, and it's sort of a challenge to myself and what I tell artists that I'm interviewing with, doing studio visits with, is how to create a new kind of interaction that isn't just, I do this, it does that. So this is the first sort of prototype of piece. It's based on Echo and Narcissus, and it's a sound video installation, so as a starting point. So you walk in, there's nothing here, because it doesn't start to happen until you're actually over the tank of water. But you hear a female's voice being distributed through a multi-channel system in kind of an echo of different sort of suggestive phrases. And then once you interact with the piece, you see an image of yourself that's being manipulated by a computer. It still just looks like a video image. You're not actually interacting with it. But then if you put your hand in the water, it's a touch table, so it affects the image. But eventually, my next idea to work with this is, depending on how you move, you begin to influence the image, but you don't control it. And that's sort of the idea that I'm trying to find, and when I talk to artists, I'm looking for now, is this point between control and lack of control. And the best way I can do this as a sort of metaphor is George Lewis, who is a composer and uses technology, came up with two kinds of interfaces, a dog interface and a cat interface. The dog interface does everything you want it to, and the cat interface does nothing you want it to. I've realized recently that in having a dog, they don't always do what you want it to do, so that's sort of but that's the sort of cliche. I want to explore this idea of what I call the dolphin interface. When you teach a dolphin a trick, you repeat it enough, they begin to not obey the trick and start. So for instance, this is something actually our dog did at one point. I was throwing a ball and he was fetching it and bringing it back up onto the bed. And then at one point, he stood at the edge of the bed and then threw the ball onto the ground, expecting me to go get the ball and bring it to him. That's what I want an interface to do. I want somehow that feeling of you making the effort or something happening that allows that to happen. And that's sort of what I'm very interested in the future in the quote, interactive works of, and the way I like to say what I want the work to do, I want the work to actually disrupt the traditional notion of interactivity. And for me, my approach, which I'm finding out is not that original to get around some of these problems, is you walk up to the piece and you don't know it's a computer-based work. All the interactive works we've done, you do this and you see that, or you see people doing this and you see that it's responding to them. This looks like any video sound installation you would see in a normal gallery. And so you don't have the expectation. So to me, first you have to lower the expectation that it's actually interactive in order to allow more possibilities to happen. And that's sort of the idea of both my practice and the kind of work in this area that I'm looking for. So let me see if there's any other quotes I want to just mention. This is the Philip Glass quote, "New language needs a new technique. If you don't need a new technique, it's probably not new." And I just think whether you use the word technique or technology, I think it exponentially changes the parameters when in that area, if you can find a new technology to express the language you want to express. So that's it, and I guess I'm going to have automatically questions. I don't have to really ask for them. So thank you very much, and fire away.